All right, a very good afternoon to all, and thank you for attending this session. Today we have Mr. Faisal from Ministry XR as our guest speaker, and he'll be sharing some information regarding the process of VR game development. Just some background information about Mr. Faisal. He is an XR content developer. He is currently leading XR development at Ministry XR as an XR project manager. He aims to create an extended reality experience via the merge of AR, VR, and XR. And if you have any questions throughout the session, we will have a Q&A session towards the very end, so stay tuned for that. And now I'd like to invite Mr. Faisal to begin his sharing session.
Hello, can you guys hear me? Okay, so hello, my name is Faisal and welcome to my talk titled Understanding VR Games Development. So this would be a brief guide of what developing games for VR actually means. So I'll be talking for about an hour here, so hopefully it's going to be a fun and a fruitful event for all of us. Okay, so these are the things that basically we're going to talk about. I'm going to have just a short introduction, a bit of what I do actually, and coming into understanding VR games, and then coming to gaming concepts and even development tools. So I think like we kind of like really a bit of understand like what VR is more or less. We would just want to go into a depth into it. So this talk would be semi-general and semi-technical in a bit. So introduction. We'll start with basically just my name again. So my name is Faisal Adha. I'm the lead XR engineer at Ministry XR. I'm also the creative content producer, a certified HRDF trainer. I lead VR and MR project developments, and I oversee creative content in whatever is that goes on in MXR. And we also have two initiatives that I'm fronting. One is the Spatial Frontier. It's basically for education, and it's one part of it is actually in APU. The XR studio itself, I think like whenever the PKP or the MCO has been lifted, hopefully you guys will have a taste of what goes on in the XR studio. They have the HoloLens with the edX station there. They have some VR experiences, mainly using the Oculus Quest. They even have like the VolCap studio over there. And then we also have our own internal MXR gaming. And this is basically where we're creating like awesome VR game stuff. So just look forward to that, hopefully. And apart from work, I study more or less on VR. I've been into the creative side, and I play a lot of games. Right now I'm playing some Genshin Impact and My Time at Portia, and I watch New Japan Pro Wrestling. Okay, so understanding VR games development. To understand basically VR games development, first off, we have to go, what is VR per se? So what is actually VR to begin with? Because like, I think like we kind of roughly know what is VR, but how do you define it compared to like when you have other realities out there, such as like VR, there's AR, there's MR, and then some of you might not have actually heard of XR, which is extended reality. Now, what is that, right? So to put it bluntly, basically all of these different realities fall under that one huge umbrella called XR, which is the extended reality. So XR encompasses virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. Okay, so that is basically what we at MXR we strive for. This is basically just a component of what MXR does. Actually, we more focus on MXR. We focus more on spatial computing, which encompasses a lot more things, such as blockchain, Internet of Things, and a lot of other really cool tech out there. So here I'm just gonna briefly share with you what VR, AR, and MR, just in case like next time anybody will just want to ask you guys what is VR, AR, MR, then you kind of like have an understanding of it. So VR is kind of really among all of it, VR is kind of like the most straightforward. So it is immersing people into a completely virtual environment. So it's a whole different world in itself. It's a different realm by itself. You think about, like, if you've seen The Matrix, Ready Player One. It's kind of those kind of concepts where you immerse yourself in a whole different world, where all of your senses are basically seeing or feeling or sensing something different that really tells your brain that you're somewhere different. You're in another place, in another time, in another body, in another whole environment. That's basically VR. So right now, all of the VR headsets, they mostly play around with with the eyesight, because the headsets is basically on your eye. So visually, you see yourself in a different world. With the headphones on, you can hear that you're actually in a different world. So all of that combining, if you can actually communicate within that virtual world, that basically brings a whole different level of immersion. Even the sense of smell, that basically helps in level of immersiveness as well. So that's VR. What is AR then? So augmented reality, I think, like a lot of us, we're kind of have experienced some form of AR, because it is kind of like it's just creating overlay of virtual content, but it doesn't really interact with the environment. Think of the early stages of Pokemon Go. So if you played Pokemon Go, you recall that you can see the Pokemon in the real world. But it's not really interacting with the surface. It's not really on the floor. You're just kind of like placing it there. So it's not exactly there, but it's kind you're tricking yourself to seeing that it's there. So that's basically AR. So that's in the earlier version of Pokemon Go. Nowadays, I think, like, from the past few years, if you guys are still playing it though, they can interact with the surface. You can actually put Pikachu on top of a surface, and then it would interact with that particular table. Um, so that what does that does it still falls under AR? Well, technically yes, it is still under augmented reality, but it comes into the realm of mixed reality. So this is basically what a lot of people are going for right now, which is a mixed reality, which is a mixture of virtual reality and the reality, the actual reality. So it creates virtual objects that can interact with the actual environment. Take basically like the later versions of Pokemon VR, Pokemon AR, or even like mixed reality devices like the HoloLens. So like the HoloLens, where you can experience it in the XR Studio in APU. So it basically augments virtual objects in front of you, but those augmented objects can detect surface. You can actually place things on top of your table. You can actually measure the space around it. So why surgeons basically use this? Basically, they can interact with information data while doing their work. And then because it's a wearable, you don't really have to use your hands to hold devices such as like you're holding your phone of some sort. So it frees their hand to actually do stuff and be productive. So that's basically the future for what mixed reality can bring into in work life, basically, even on play, even on how you basically do your living. That's basically how you want to do it. But so this is basically just a brief understanding of what MR is. So let's get back to the topic at hand, which is VR games. So what is VR game? What is a VR game? Basically, we know what is VR, and I'm assuming most of you guys are game students or game enthusiasts or even VR enthusiasts. So you might be inclined. So what constitute as a VR game, basically? So technically speaking, it is kind of like as it is straightforward. These are games that are played in VR, in virtual reality. But is does all game can be played within virtual reality? I mean, like, think of all of the genres available for games. You got like action games, fighting games, real-time strategy games, Dota, whatnot. Does all of those games can be played within the VR? Does all stories, like very storytelling games, story-driven games, can they be experienced within VR itself? So these are the things we want to explore, because there are certain concepts and technical understanding that we need to understand before we're going to actually develop VR games. That's just like not all games I mean, like, if you talk about can or cannot, yes, technically you can play any games, but is it worth it? Would you play these games in VR? So that's basically the main reason, which is like why VR games. So why would you want to make this particular game in VR? So that's basically the ultimate question. So if this particular question is not addressed from the get-go, then every all of your decisions afterward will be can be questionable, basically. So keep that in mind, basically. So when we talk about VR games, even like in the VR experience, there is this one main priority. This is the why VR, compared to any other mediums in the world, VR has this one crucial thing, actually, that's really very, very important before we start actually conceptualizing anything at all. What would you think is that particular priority? If you think about gaming in general, you would think about engagement, you would think about fun, you think about play, the flow, the story, right? So all of this is important. Not to say not it's not important, but in VR specifically, you would target comfort. Why? You want to make sure VR, when your user is playing VR, because you are strapped to your headset, all of your senses, most of your senses are basically imagining yourself in a different realm, in different world, in a different environment, in different experience itself. Comfort level is the main thing. So you want to make sure that you are comfortable to navigate around, to walk around, to explore around, because motion sickness. This is something of a prevalent thing that if you do not cater to this, a lot of people will not maybe play the game. They cannot actually experience VR because motion sickness, even though with the update of hardware, software, the higher refresh rates, the better comfort level, the better weight distribution or whatnot, there will be some people that has that level of motion sickness, as you can see from the graph. In average, a lot of there are certain people still has that level of motion sickness. So it all comes back on how you would design the experience itself, and it comes back to the comfort level. If you're not comfortable to go on, then you would just take off the headset and then you don't play. It's different when you play a game in other different mediums, like on your console or on the PC, because you're on your couch, you're very comfortable, right? You're comfortable sitting down, holding your controller, holding your mouse and keyboard and whatnot. So you're comfortable. You can do whatever you want. So in VR, it has to be that first thing and foremost. So all of these gaming concepts that we're gonna explore after this is basically comes back to that sole purpose. Basically, all of that, it can one way or another would contribute that particular concept, to that particular idea of bringing comfort. So these are some gaming concepts for VR specifically, what we need to understand when creating a gaming concept. So there is the concept of 3 degrees of freedom and 6 degrees of freedom. So these are two types of VR experiences. So not many, we'll just basically just explore what these are. So 3 degrees of freedom. This is basically in the era of mobile VR, like the Samsung what was it? Samsung Gear VR, and then the cardboard VR. So it has 3 degrees of freedom, which is your three axis XYZ, but it's only rotation. So it's basically like your phone accelerator. So basically you can turn up, turn left, turn right, turn down and whatnot, but you cannot move front, back or sideways. So there is that limitation. But the good thing is it's a casual, it's more of a casual experience. So there are certain content is best to be performed in the 3 degrees of freedom kind of VR. Whereas compared to 6 degrees of freedom, it's a lot more immersive because you add that extra degrees of freedom where you can actually move around, you can actually turn, you can actually duck and whatnot. So it gives your game or your experience another level of immersiveness. So it allows complex interactions. Like some VR headsets comes with a controller, but a very simple controller which has 3 degrees of freedom as well. So it means that you lose part of the complex interaction. You can only just rotate and point stuff, but you cannot touch stuff or really do interaction. So in those certain cases, you would need a 6 degrees of freedom headsets like the Vive or Oculus Rift or Quest that allows complex interactions and allows more engagement. So this is basically when you talk about VR. Yes, this is roughly the two main concepts that you would see. So the next thing on the list is basically the navigation or locomotion. So to explore in a VR world, there are multiple ways to basically just move around. If you were to say, if you play a game on the PC or console, to navigate, you just use your controllers and whatnot. So you just move because you're not moving. The screen is over there, so the immersiveness level is different. Because right now the screen is right in front of your eye, so every little movement, every subtle movement is is a lot more immersive and engaging because you can actually turn your head around and then you can see things a lot quicker. So this is why navigation and locomotion is really important on how the game design is going to be designed. So these are roughly the main concepts of how you would navigate basically. There's teleportation, which basically it's kind of like a default VR experience. How do you want to navigate? You just point the controller with a laser at like a spot on the floor, and then you just press it, and then it just teleports there. So depending on how you would execute that teleportation effect or the animation itself, it can be very casual, where it's just like a blink, and then it opens up your eye, you're there. And there are certain games they do this with more intense, with like you're sprinting in front of it. So it's like how Doom VFR does it. So when you teleport, it's not really teleporting, because it's kind of like just a short sprint in front. So why this is important? Because compared when you see it on the screen and when you see it in VR, those subtle differences would mean the whole world in the level of being very comfortable or being very nauseating. Okay, which goes true as well when you talk about manual locomotion as well. So this is basically using your controller or buttons. You just basically the press of a button, you move front, move back, move right, move left. For some people, this might be the best way for them, but for some, it just doesn't make sense to them because it creates that reverse motion sickness basically. Because why does motion sickness happens is basically your brain, your eyes is actually seeing the world move. So it's telling your brain that the world is moving, but physically you're not moving, right? You're just pressing a button. But you're seeing yourself is moving, but your physical body is not going anywhere. So that creates that motion sickness effect. So that's basically the idea of it. So why manual controls or auto controls, which basically just moves automatically without you controlling, has a higher chance of motion sickness. But it's still depending on the context. There are ways you can cater to it. Like for instance, if you're experiencing a VR within a car and you see the car there, you see the steering wheel and then everything is moving, but you see yourself in the car. So it tells your brain that you're in the car, like you're in the actual car. So when the world moves, it still kind of makes sense, So these are one ways you can tackle motion sickness in locomotion effect. Usually games they would like settings, UI, or you press a button or you auto. So there are certain games they give you that particular option, which is like how Half-Life Alex does it. You can basically they allow you to teleport, they allow you to shift, they allow you to do continuous motion using the controller. So it depends on the user, but it gives another aspect of designing level of technicalities for the developers themselves. So you have to consider, because like even how you design the level, how you place your objects to interact with, how you put your menu UIs and whatnot, would all be affected on how you choose to navigate in the game. Okay, so for instance, if the game allows you to teleport. So there, and then there are certain mechanics that is more beneficial when you can strafe left and right, like say for a shooter game. So for teleporting, it sometimes takes that particular feeling away from it. So it depends on the game, it depends on the context. So this is basically why navigation and locomotion is very important in VR development. So next, when you can navigate, obviously you want to interact with the game. So there are multiple ways you can interact with objects within the game, based from the early versions of VR where you don't really have much of control, or even using like the cardboard VR, the 3 degrees of freedom VR, where you don't really have much sensitivity on the controller. You would use the gaze interaction. You just basically you just look at something, you interact with it. So there is minimal interaction into it. When you have a more advanced controller, which allows complex movement, then you can allow direct interaction or even laser point interaction. So direct interaction is basically where you can just like physically, as if it's actually there. So you have that depth of space and you can actually lift the thing up. You can pick up your gun, you can pick up your sword, you can pick up a box, anything. Laser point interaction is more towards something that's not within your hand's reach. So it's something far, something you want to put on the wall, on the ceiling or whatnot. So something you want to interact from afar and pick it, like just teleport it directly to your hand. So you can that in terms you use the laser point interactions. Nowadays, since there are certain devices that allows finger gesture interactions, which to say that it can detect your hands, so you can actually see your physical hands. I mean, like the concept of it when speaking, it's not as mind blowing as you actually experiencing it firsthand. Like to see your hand in virtual reality is a marvel in its own, and that brings a whole different world of how you want to interact with the world, because you can swipe things, you can touch things, you can gestures, you can train the application to detect a particular gesture. You can do an okay sign, you can do a thumbs up, and then something would happen, right? So imagine like the possibilities of gaming or even VR experiences that can cater to your fingers, right? So it's something to think about. And so these are basically ways that you want to do interactions. So designing for VR is one crucial thing as well, because a lot of people, when they design, usually you would draw kind of like create a concept art, create like a sketch. You would create a 3D, you would create like a mock-up design and whatnot. But to design for VR, you need that extra perspective. It's a mindset basically, because you have to consider the spacing around you. It's not flat. It's not, especially in UI design, you do not have the borders of your monitor. You do not have like to put a health bar on the bottom of the screen. It doesn't work in VR because your head is constantly moving. If you see that on the lower side of your head and then you try to look at it, but it moves along, so it doesn't make sense. So that's why UI design, UI placement, even like how do you place your interactive stuff. Let's say if you have like a gun on top of a ceiling of the car, so you want to make sure that they can see it from the peripheral vision, because they can see it. You put it too far ahead, like just slightly to the back, then you don't see it anymore. So this is why you would need a lot more research on how to design in VR. And there are certain people, they created like these templates basically on how to design for VR. Basically, you want to design a 360 world or a 180 degree of where everything is placed, because it won't exactly be the same when you try to sketch it out on a flat surface and how everything is placed on where. But when you actually translate that into a virtual space, sometimes it just doesn't make sense. So this is why designing and prototyping is plays a really crucial part in developing for VR. So there are ways basically we're gonna try to do. That's why in VR development you would spend a lot of your time just to design the experience itself, because it's quite crucial. Talking about UI, user interface, like I said just before, you want to make sure that you can see everything, and you want to make sure that the placement is comfortable enough for you, that you don't really have to look so far ahead just to see a UI or an interaction. It just doesn't make sense, or just to go too far low. It depends on the game as well. If it's something that you want the user to see, then you have to make sure that it is placed in a position that they can actually see. And then how you would design your user interface. Will it be more textual? Will it be too visual, just symbols and whatnot? Because you have to consider that reading in VR, some people it's not as easy, depending on the hardware, because certain hardware they don't render that text really good. Actually, you would see some jitter or pixelated and whatnot. So it just, if there's too much text, especially small size text, it will create some problem for the user to really understand things. So it's best to try to visualize most of your UI, or make the text a lot bigger and more clearer to the user. And then because of the placement of the UI, you want to make sure that coming back to your context of the game, are you encouraging the user to move around, to look around? Do you want them to actually look behind them? Do you want them to actually go down? Do you want them to actually use their hands for UI? Do you want them to just to look their palm, or just turn around like looking at your watch? So all of those things comes into play on how you would design your user interface. Okay. um, okay, so that is talking about UI. When we talk about first person or third person, this is basically on how the field of view of the virtual reality world itself. Generally speaking, a lot of VR games are in first person, but there are certain games they do third person VR, such as like Hellblade Senua. Some people they prefer third person where they don't be first hand the character. So that's basically the main takeaway from it. Why would you want to design the game in the first person or in the third person? In the sense that you have to consider that the main experience that you want for the user itself, are you the main character or are you following the main character? Are you just observe? Are you another character apart from the main character? Right. So there are certain, these are the types of concepts that you have to consider when you do. It's not to say that one is the one, it's wrong or right decision, but it's all come back to context. Let's say, like, if you say you're doing like a typical VR shooting game, shooting zombies, where you're the hero, you're the main protagonist, so you want to be the action. So you would basically, it's a no-brainer that you just go for first-person VR. But if you're going in a form like a storytelling game, like you are following this particular character to see their story, and you as another entity in the particular game, you're assisting this particular character. So yes, like how Moss did basically. So you are another character. Basically, you are helping the main character and you're experiencing it with the main character. So that's basically how they envision Moss, for a third person kind of VR experience. So it all comes back to your experience, and then because of this, it comes back to all of the factors that we just mentioned before as well, like the UI placement. Like, how would you design your UI for a first person VR and in a third person VR might not necessarily be the same. How you would move your character, it's not necessarily the same. The locomotion, navigation, as well as the comfort level. There are, it might be more comfortable to view it from a third person, but it depends on how you design, how you move the camera, how you play around with the level design and whatnot. So all of these things all comes back to the comfort level that we mentioned right at the very start of this talk. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit on non-VR games, VR port. So we know when the advent of VR first launched, there are people who says that, oh, why wouldn't it be swell that this particular game can be in VR or that particular game be in VR? So they port games basically. These games are not designed for VR, but they port it to a VR platform. So such as like these two icons. I'm sure if you played a lot of games, you'll be recognizing most of these two, which is Skyrim and Fallout 4. So these are kind of like among the few non-VR games that they ported into VR. So at first glance, the experience was really great, but in the long term, there are certain things that you have to consider when you are porting the VR, the non-VR games into VR. The first thing is basically you have your hands. You don't use a controller. You have hand controllers now. So where do you put your UI? How do you interact with the UI? Does your game requires you to type before this? So how do you type with the hand controller? Like that particular shot of the Fallout gun, the UI placement now is on the gun itself because you want to make sure that the user sees the VR, the UI itself rather than on the menu or not. Um, so these are basically you have to consider, especially like how Skyrim, when you want to eat your food, you open up a menu and whatnot, and then you have to scroll down very, very, very far just to find that particular food that you want to eat or that particular item you wanna pick. But saying it when having experiencing it on the PC or on the console is much different when you are actually experiencing it in VR because it creates that level of hassle that you have to like really scroll down and then really find that, and then there's like text. Both of these games are story driven. There's a lot of voiceovers, there's like text box down there. So how do you place those text box? Would you just place it down there and then have the user look down? Would you have the text to be anchored to your screen so wherever you see the text is there? Or would it be contextualized with the character? So if you have the character like here and then the text box is over here, so that kind of makes sense, like a speech bubble. So would you design it something like that? So all of these things basically has to be considered in how do UI placement, even menu system. Like for instance, take Fallout 4, you have the Pip Boy on the right hand. Previously, that thing encompasses all of your screen because you just press a button and then the whole thing becomes your menu. Because right now, it's actually in context with your hand. It's actually there in your hand, and you have to navigate it using the actual button there. So is it some level of immersiveness or does it create issues, right? Is it a problem to do that? So you have to consider a lot of those things. Even navigation and locomotion, like previous, you want to make sure, does the game make sense if you added the teleport, or does it not make sense? Will it create motion sickness now that you're controlling like you will control on a keyboard and mouse or a console controller? How would you do your cutscenes? Basically, before this, your cutscenes is basically the whole screen, but now you are not experiencing the cutscene firsthand, but you just basically just how games they usually do it, basically just put the the canvas in front of you and then you're just experiencing it there. So does it actually gives that more level of immersiveness, or do you play the cutscene like around you and then you are still there but you are limited to your moving, right? So those are the things you have to consider as well. And as always, the user experience itself, how the user would experience all of the mechanics, like how would you change your gun, how would you reload, how you cast your spells, how would you want to create uh, interact with people. So all of these things we want to have to consider, because bear in mind that most of these games were not designed for VR. Why do I emphasize on this is basically because I'm sure like some of you might have or will be creating some games, creating desktop games, creating console games, but it was not intended for VR. So maybe one day down the line you would think, oh, okay, if I can afford a VR headset one day, then I want to buy it and I want to try to port this particular game into VR. So then that particular decision you have to consider. Do I work on porting whatever I have into VR? Does it make sense? Would the experience be the same? Would I get the same user experience as how I did? Would it be better? Would it be worse? And is it better if you want to just create a whole different game specifically for VR. Really work from the ground up to design a game specifically made for VR. So these are the things basically you want to consider when porting something that's not designed for VR into VR. Because I always say that when you're designing something, you have to consider the end platform. If you are designing something for a console, there are ways of designing the level, the controls, and navigation. If it is designed for something on mobile, if it is designed for something for the web, I mean, so for using the mouse and keyboard on the PC, or even for VR, for AR, for mixed reality, all of it has a different design sense. It's not just technical understanding, but design sense is really really important in this case on how you want to explore the world. Even story driven games, like how would you envision Assassin's Creed in VR? Does it make sense? Do you want to do that parkour thing in VR, like in real? You're first person everything, so can you try to like imagine that? So that's basically the things that we have to consider when we want to create a VR games. Okay, so hopefully that covers most of the concepts basically. So really just search into it, but this is basically generally speaking the more relevant things, and it's not really that specific, but it's something it's something to have in the back of your mind when you want to create or start the development on a VR game. So those we talked about, we spent half an hour a bit for talking about the gaming concept. Um, Talking about tools now. So you have an idea, you conceptualize, you design, you've done your research, you played a lot of video VR games, and now you want to try to, okay, I want to do this. Let's develop. So what do I need? What do I need to have to do this? So first and foremost, you need the hardware for obvious reasons. This is the main limitations of VR. It's something that it's you have to just get it. If you don't have a VR headset, then you cannot experience VR. There are mobile VR that you can try out on the phone, which just limits to usage of something like the Google Cardboard VR, but there are limitations of it as well. So we are aware of that. But there's a lot of VR hardwares out there. There's a lot of VR headsets out there. There's the Oculus Quest, even the Oculus Quest 2. There's the Valve Index, the very expensive Valve Index that boasts to be like one of the best VR headsets ever for now. There's the Rift, the Vive, even the Go that's been discontinued already, unfortunately. And for PlayStation owners, they have the PSVR. So all of this basically has different. What's the difference between these headsets? Some of it are wired, some of them are not wired, some of them are sensors, some of them do not. Some of them are 3 degrees of freedom, some of them are 6 degrees of freedom. Some may have all of those, but boast a bit more on the resolution, more on the refresh rate. So it's more on the technical side. So how do you choose which hardware you want to buy? So first and foremost, this is basically your budget lah. But pushing that aside, it's in the end targeting your target audience. What is your target audience in the end? Who is your target audience? Is it going to be an experience where you will be sitting down all the time, or you need to move around in room scale? You want to shoot stuff and whatnot. Consider that we mentioned about Skyrim and Fallout. Those games are very deep. It's a very deep world, and it's a very engaging game with a very huge storytelling lore. And if you recall, if for anybody of you has played those types of games, a play session would last for about an hour or even 3 to 4 hours in one setting, because you're sitting down, you're comfortable using your mouse and keyboard, using your console, controller, whatnot. So those kinds of experiences is okay. But for VR, can you imagine that you are standing up, moving around for an hour or 3 hours straight? It might not it might not work for a lot of people. For some people, they can only tolerate 10 to 20 minutes of VR experience. I think, "Yeah, okay, I'm done. I might gonna throw up if I go just go on." So these are the things you have to consider. That's why these are the main things. Like when you take a game that's not meant for VR, when you put it into a VR context, you would not get the same engagement level, because you will not be able to play it straight for 10 hours as you would be able to do that on a console or on a PC. I know some of us, we do that when we play games on our PC. We spend 3 to 5 hours in it every day, because it's okay for that. But in VR, you have to consider that. So depending on the experiences, they will determine your what kind of headset you can basically go for. Then there are the talk about the cables. Not all, a lot of VR headsets, they do rely on the power of the PC, that's PC based VR, such as the HTC Vive or the Oculus Rift, or even the Valve Index. So as much as power the headset has, it still relies on the PC itself. So the PC would be the main processor for the VR device. So in saying that, it requires cable management, and then some of it has external sensors like the Valve Index and the Vive. But there are certain headsets nowadays, like the Oculus Rift S. They don't have that sensors anymore. You only have because it's already internal sensors. It's kind of like the Oculus Quest, where it's a standalone VR, which does not require any PC, any sensors or whatnot. It doesn't have any cables, so it gives you that level of freedom. But what's the difference is basically you don't get the power of the processing power of the PC. That's the main drawback for a standalone VR. Standalone VR headsets, such as on the Oculus Quest or the Vive Focus or the Vive Cosmos. I'm sorry, the Cosmos still relies on the PC. Vive Focus, basically, they are designed for a mobile version of the VR. So in this sense, all of their applications is built like you would to build a mobile application. And the rendering power is based on the headset itself. So it is a standalone. It's a mobile processing power. It has its limitations, but it is getting better. We know that the phones nowadays is getting better, that you can really play AAA quality on your mobile, but it would not be as powerful as a PC that has like RTX 3090 or something. So if you were to play Half-Life Alyx on the Valve Index using a $10,000 PC that has a RTX 3090, that particular experience itself you will not get from a standalone VR. So that is that. Okay. And then obviously wireless technology is still reliant on wireless technology, your Wi-Fi mainly. So if the connection speed is not so good, then the experience might suffer. So that's one drawback. Some of these wireless, but it depends on it's still depending on the experience. There are certain headsets like the Vive Pro. HTC does provide like a wireless adapter that converts the Vive into a wireless device. It still requires sensors, but you do not need the cables anymore. So that brings the issue of latency. Sometimes it depends on the controller, on the headset itself, or on the connections itself. So these are the things you have to bear in mind when choosing the device. So those are the hardware. Basically, we can talk all day about the hardware, about the specifications, the refresh rate, or not, but I'm not going to go into the details of it. We're talking about when you want to develop, you would need the software, obviously. So you need your engine, basically. The main two engines that a lot of VR game developers would use is Unity and Unreal. I know there are a few softwares like, I can't remember, Lumberyard or even Blender. They allow VR integration as well, but roughly speaking, these are the main things. Onto your right, these are toolkits that you would require to be able to program the VR applications, such as the VRTK, SteamVR, Oculus SDK, or Vive Wave. So all of this is basically our plugins that you would require to program the VR interactions, like how the ground is placed, how buttons are controlled, how if there's a hand gestures, how you do with hand gestures. So these is more about preferences, and depending on the software that you use, depending on the plugin that you use, the documentation resource might differ. Some has a lot of documentations, like the VRTK and Unity, they have a lot of documentation on it. But for some features, not so much. Like we did last time, I recall, like when we did like a VR property VR experience back in my old company, we were doing a multiplayer experience using Photon. So at that point in time, it was really a hassle to integrate VR with multiplayer, but it's not something impossible. It is possible. It's something doable. It's just that you have to consider all of the options depending on the feature that you want. Do you require like hand gesture controls? Then there are, for I think Steam VR has that hand gesture control. Even Oculus SDK, they have that hand gesture control, but the documentation will not be as extensive as how in the Unity documentation for hand gestures control. So these are the things you have to consider when selecting your software. But in the end, it's all about preferences and what's your target experience would be. So now you have the hardware, you have the software, then you would need the people to do it, right? You would need the human resource to it. So to create a VR game development, it's basically more or less the same as any game development team, or even like an application development team. You have your creative side, you have the technical side, you have the people working in between. You have the concept artist. Obviously, you want to create the concept, creating the idea. You have the 3D, you have the UI design. You would create all of those assets and whatnot. You would create the flow as a UX designer, create the game design, level design, animate those things, and audio. Audio is a very important aspect in VR, because like we're gonna get to that later. Talk about spatial audio. On the technical side, there is obviously the character programmer, environment programmer, VR programmer itself, analytics, game mechanic. There is one more as well, which is the VR game experience designer. So this guy is not, it's hard to say where do you want to put this guy into. Is it under your creative or under your technical? It's because it's kind of a bit of both, basically, because this guy or this particular team, you would need to basically understand the design aspects that would happen within a VR world. And then they have to understand the VR technicalities of it as well, so to know how to design around it. Okay, so the technical side should always work with prototyping, white boxing, just to get the feel of it, so that the designers can really understand what they are designing it for, right? You cannot just design or without understanding the final product, the final experience. If you do not test out the design, how does it look like in VR? Such as like how you would design a your main menu, basically the first thing that you will see in a game. Some designs you would design it for, like how would you would design for a PC game or based on the monitor. But you would take that design, put it into a VR application, and then just test it out, just to see, does it make sense? Does the layout of it make sense? Can I read the text? Can I see the text? Does it clearly indicate that it's a button that I'm supposed to click? Am I supposed to reach out and click it interactively? Am I supposed to use a laser pointer? Am I supposed to gaze with it? So all of these things is in the design, where you do the prototyping in the very, very early stages of the development. This is why prototyping is a really important part of the development phase itself. So if talk about development phase, it's not much different from any other game development, but the testing is a lot more, I feel. That you need to go back and test and iterate a lot more times, because it's a different medium by itself. It's a different medium compared to something that's limited to the screen, is basically because you can turn around. That's like the main thing in VR. So this is roughly a development. You don't really necessarily have to have all of this, but it's just like the hat that you would have to wear when developing. Things to consider when in development. So I think this is kind of like a recap of the things that we said, we touched upon within this particular talk, which is UI UX. What's the best way you want to design your UI, your main menu? The other thing is basically 3D optimization. So this is one thing that a lot of people they fail to understand. Optimization is really prevalent in gaming development as well, because you are working with real-time rendering processing. But in VR, it takes that a more serious step, especially when you're doing it for standalone VR devices, because they are considered kind of like more towards mobile devices. So you need to really optimize the application. The experience needs to be very smooth. The frame rate needs to be very high, because if any drop of frame rate, if the user does not feel comfortable, they can't play it. It just comes back to the optimization, right? The comfort, which is the first thing we talked about. So how would you optimize the 3D in this sense? Because you have to consider this is a VR application. You can interact with things, you can look around things, so there's a lot more you have to consider. You have to play around with level of uh, depth of field, basically, and the level of the detail, the LOD. So, and how you would interact in VR, that plays a part as well. Not everything is interactable, and how would you make that apparent to your user? Is everything interactable? Is everything that you see interactable? So that in the design itself has to be very prevalent. This goes towards any kind of game development as well, but it's a lot more prevalent in VR because it's kind of like right in your face. Spatial audio is very important in VR, because like apart compared to when you do audio for uh, TV or movie or something that's limited towards your screen, audio signal that it's then unless and until the camera turns, it's already on the left channel, because the camera changes whenever the director wants to change the camera. When you're doing a game, or even when you're doing a VR game, your head is the camera. You can turn around anytime when you like, and then the audio is has a lot more impact when you are really into the VR experience. So if you were to, and some people they can use the audio itself as a guidance. If you can get guide your users to go somewhere, to look somewhere using just audio, so that is basically why special audio is you can hear like a sound of an engine from the right, you would just turn and look at it, and then you would assume that the audio would come from the engine, right? But a lot of games they have to play this something as a more put in more emphasis on that. Navigation we covered. Analytics is quite important as well, because you want to understand where your users are actually looking at to improve, to understand that is your UI design working, is your level design working, does everything go make sense and whatnot. So that's where you can track back from the data that you cover, because you can track on where the users is actually looking, not to just deprive of your privacy or whatnot, but it is for studying. It is basically for research to understand how to make games better or make the experience better. VR performance as well, it still comes back to how do you optimize the whole game, being it from visual or in the technical side. The device itself, like we mentioned, like the considerations that we talked about, target audience, motion sickness, we mentioned that a few times as well as prototyping. So these are the things that really you have to consider into development. You need to always prototype. You need to always test. You would not understand the importance of testing VR experiencing, because there are things that if you assume a lot, then you would lose a lot of parts, the fun aspect of being in the VR, and you might make it not comfortable at the very end because you didn't spend that much time in testing. Okay, so that covers basically the talk. Right now, I just want to share just a bit of what I do at MXR Works, MXR, and then basically my works. So in this, I'm going to share two videos basically. One is basically the Spatial Frontier. Well, this is basically the XR studio that you have in APU, and another video is basically a VR game that we developed in collaboration with Persona Theory back 2 years ago. It is still a prototype, so it is a really fun game, but it really emphasizes on the VR aspect of it. I think I don't really have much time to show you both right now, but I think I want to show you the 66.6 FM. So I'm going to play this video for a while, and then I hope the moderator can mute my mic for a while, so and then you guys can have a listen to this.
Little one, sleep tight.
Evening, road warriors. You're back with Charles on Nevermind.
So, who would you like to be, Jack?
Would you ever kill someone, Jack?
And yeah, that's basically the 66.6 FM that you saw. It's a very interesting story-driven game. It's very dark. It explores more on the psychology of a man coming home from work. It's basically he's contemplating whether or not to kill his wife or not. That's basically the game, and you get to learn about these other characters, and then you have a chat with all of these entities and whatnot, and then you can understand why that was the main motivation of it, and then at the very end of it you can decide whether or not you're going to proceed with what you were your first initial objective was. uh, Another the VR experience that I've worked on last time, which is the VR Autoplex. We worked. This is using the Subaru VR, the Subaru cars, the Forester and the XV. So we created like a VR showroom for them, and it's available in Taiwan and Singapore and other regions in the Southeast Asia, if I'm not mistaken. But it's really fun project as well, where you can experience the car in virtual reality. So that gives us a lot of experience on how we want to design VR experiences, and then comes to how we design 66.6 FM, how we place the phone and interactions and whatnot. And hopefully we're going to create more VR. Basically, that's hold on. And that's basically the end of my talk. Thank you. If you have any questions or whatnot, we can move on to the Q&A sessions. And this is my email if you have some questions you want to drop by. So I think that covers our time. I think we're on time. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Faisal. I'm sure I'm interested in your upcoming actually. And actually, we already have quite a few questions up for already posted chat. And if anyone else has any additional questions, do put them in the comment box. And I think we can begin the Q&A session right now. So we have the first question here regarding on how much it costs to develop a VR game.
Okay, first thing is always about the cost, right? I already put that in budget. So it depends, depending on what type of VR experience you want, because the costing would come not just on the device, but on the development and the research on the studying itself. Because developing a VR game is not necessarily just limiting towards just the hardware. Like we mentioned about under the gaming concept is there's a lot more research into it depending on what kind of games that you want to develop, depending on the asset creation of it. Does the asset creation needs to be high resolution? It will need to be realistic. Are you focusing more on the effects, or are you focusing more on the audio development or design? Take Beat Saber for instance. Beat Saber is strictly quite simple game. It's quite straightforward game where you just bash musical boxes that comes into your way. So in a design sense, it's not really that difficult, but the cost might come into the music itself because you are licensing music. Well, we're in the case for like Half-Life Alex, those kind of games will cost a lot more, because there's storytelling, there's a lot more assets, there's a lot more virtual world. So it all depends on the scale of the world, depending on your interactions, and then it depends on what kind of interaction that you want to go. If you're targeting something for something chill, something casual, which is like a 3 degrees of freedom experiencing that you can use your cardboard VR, it shouldn't cost that much actually, unless you want to cost in the mobile phone in itself. So the cost might be within the 360 video, the audio production, and the minimal interactions that you use your gaze. But if you're creating something for the Oculus Quest, so the Oculus Quest itself has, I think it's not really that expensive as any other VR devices. It's about 299 399 US dollars, not including shipping. So the content can be more because you can interact with it, because has a 6 degrees of freedom controller, so you can play around with more interactions. So what kind of interaction you want? Is it just a point and shoot game? Is it a mechanical engineering where you have to solve puzzles using your hands? You need to go back. So that would determine the costing on how you would place the budget towards VR game development. So hopefully that answers the question.
All right, then, well, for Dr. C's question about the general VR development process, I do believe that you actually already have explained it throughout your presentation. So I believe we can move on to this question.
I'm sorry?
Regarding the next question is that can someone develop for VR without having any knowledge of programming? And how big is the virtual reality game market in Malaysia currently?
Okay, to develop a VR without knowing programming is not necessarily impossible. It's something doable because there are certain, like, you would need some level of programming in the end, because it is still a technical field in itself. There are certain ways, like I think there are certain tools that allows minimal programming, such as even like Unity's prefabs, or even Lumberyard, or even I think Zappar, but Zappar is more on the AR thing. It has VR capabilities, but you would require some level of programming to develop a VR game. It's really, it's quite hard actually to create to develop a VR game without understanding programming. That's why we mentioned just a bit. Even though I talked a lot on the design, on the concept, but to actually program the VR is not something straightforward, like you would create any other VR, because like I said, there's a lot of testing going on. So sometimes you would follow the scripts, use the prefab as it is, but sometimes it just doesn't work. Why? And you have to test it out. You need to try it out with there are certain factors and whatnot. There are a lot of technical things. So VR would require some level of programming, if not a lot. Coming to the second question, how big is the VR game market in the Malaysia? It's not that big, because considering the VR users in Malaysia in itself, it's still very minimal. A lot not it's not that widespread in availability. There's not many stores that sells VR devices. I know that's like all IT, or even Harvey Norman doesn't sell it. I know a few stores they actually sell VR devices, but because the cost of it, we are well aware that VR devices is not something as cheap. But considering for those who can afford the new Samsung Galaxy S20 Ultra, which is about $5,000, I think about less than 2,000 for a Vive is not really that expensive. So, but coming to the question as well, it's not as big, but there are a few. And coming to this, when we look at the Steam market analytics, even Steam users in Malaysia is not paid Steam users. It's not really that huge compared to the other regions in Malaysia. So a lot of VR game developers, they usually target other regions apart from Malaysia. But unless your content is more specific for VR, for the Malaysian market, let's say if you do Malaysian content, Malaysian culture, or whatnot, then it is something to look forward to look into. Then why not? We should be able to try to delve into this things like this as well. But considering as well, because of the COVID and the pandemic, getting VR experience centers are struggling. They have been struggling for about a year or two, and now because there will be more emphasis on sharing devices in a public space, so that would be some concern within the VR world as well. So we'll have to see how this plays out, especially in our country. We just the MCO is not being lifted anytime soon, so we'll have to stay positive on that. But there is some market, not to say that there is none.
All right then. All right. Since moving on, as I believe that most of the viewers are actually APU students themselves, and we are, as year two students, internship is approaching fast. So I'm sure that there is a question is, what are your advice to students who don't really know too much about the 3D development field, but would like to get serious in this industry?
They can study. Basically, there's a lot of online resources they can actually go into. There's a lot of even communities that's into VR. There is a Facebook group called VR Malaysia. If I'm saying, there is even like IGD, the IGDA, or even on Discord, or even on Reddit. There's a lot of communities going into VR development or even VR concepts. So if you are really interested into getting into those fields, then come join these communities. They will be willing. We are more than willing to help out and share our knowledge, share our experiences. And if the pandemic the MCO lifts off and we can hang out, maybe we can like arrange play testings or game more physical game fest, like how this particular game fest was supposed to be intended, right? It's supposed to be a physical event where everybody can come over and try out these wonderful games, even like VR experiences. So we want to try to go into these communities, try to look for more online resources. I think now there's a lot in online resources. And then yes, basically you want to talk more to the lecturers, or even find out companies who are actually actively doing VR development. Like I mentioned just before, that the VR game market might not be as huge. The VR development in Malaysia is still there because it's not Malaysia. We're not targeting more towards game development for VR. There's a lot more for simulation. There's a lot more for experiential VR. There's a lot more on other promotional VR, marketing VR. So there's a lot more on that, such as like the VR showroom that I showed you before. So those are more, the VR experiences are more targeted towards that. So while you're doing that, there's no problem to venture out into VR gaming since you already have the framework and the hardware itself. So try to look more towards it, and then try to study more on the field itself. And then if you're feeling up to it, there's a lot more than just VR. Like in the XR spatial computing world, there's a lot more we can try to link up. Like imagine how you want to solve people with some dyslexia or whatnot using virtual reality, or some autism research. There are certain, I feel like I thought like there was some students who does research on how VR can assist in autism study, or how do you want to help them cope and whatnot. And other things, even like for the elderly with dementia, or with some issue, some other mental issues and whatnot, VR can help that. Or even VR can help in onboarding training workers. Instead of just like give them papers or PowerPoint slide or video on YouTube, you can just place them in the VR experience, and then they can try out the whole experience while they're onboarding. It just cuts a lot of time, saves a lot of cost in the long run, and it just gives you a whole different level of immersion while you're doing training. So that's one of the benefits of VR in general. So yeah, there's a lot
I
of
see.
avenues.
All right. Moving on to the next question. Since audio is also an important aspect, do game companies hire game students also, or do they also hire music school students?
Mm, it depends on the level of the studio, but usually the triple A game companies, they would hire the musical students, because but even in its sense, you would have to find people that has that VR or even the spatial computing mindset into it, because like even like if I can say from experience, when we were hiring UI designers for our applications, a lot of our UI designers are really good UI designers. The thing is, they have experience in designing UI for mobile application, for web application, for console, but to design something for mixed reality or augmented reality or virtual reality, it's a mindset that they need to understand, and then will need to come like on board on them. So same with music as well. You might have the best audio engineering or musically gifted guy in your team, but he needs to understand how the music, the sound effects, the background audio, the spatial audio actually works in the targeted experience. Even if you're talking about virtual reality or even augmented reality, audio plays a huge part of it. So that's why both also actually can, but it's more prevalent to hire those who are like really really good at their music, and try to adapt them into this kind of medium, rather than you would force game students to create audio. They might have the understanding of the game aspect of the VR world itself, but they're not the audio person. They're not musically gifted. Maybe they're not the ones who are, because audio centric people, they listen to a lot more things, more in more scrutiny. They can detect things that generally for us we don't pick up. We might think it sounds just good in my ear, but then you ask them, no, this is something wrong, or the frequency is off, the tempo is off, the tune is off. So you need these guys, you need these kind of people, because they know their stuff in audio world. It's just that you need to adapt the knowledge they have into this kind of medium. It's basically just that. It's a mindset in the end.
All right, then that is actually really interesting. The next question is actually asking for your opinion on Unity's new input system and if it's going to help more non-VR developers get into virtual reality development with the new mapping method.
I think so. I think so because the it gets a lot of people who wants to try it out. And I think like nowadays, even moving forward, softwares are getting a lot more accessible and gets a lot more easier. So even like if you talk about people in 5, 10 years ago, they wouldn't have the same access level as how students generally nowadays have access to these informations on how, because the tools are a lot easier now. It becomes a lot more simplified. So yes, I feel like it would get people to basically get into more into VR development, even for non VR developers, because of these kind of systems. And I'm looking forward to all of the other updates from Unity or even Unreal, if they are going into it, because there's a lot more we can do, and then they are more constantly trying to make it better, make it more simpler, for a lot of people are using. So you would get a lot more people there get their hands on developing VR content for themselves. And who knows, when the Apple launches their mixed reality AR glasses that can basically convert into a VR glasses one day, then they can make it affordable so it can be in everybody's pocket. When that day comes, technically everybody would want to develop a VR game for themselves. Like right now, when the advent of smartphones came in, everybody wants to do an app development. When the advent of augmented reality came in, a lot of people wanted to have their hands into AR. So they started out with doing programming and whatnot. Now you have visual programming, you have Zappar, you have a lot of other softwares that is just drag and drop to create AR experiences. So who's to say that that won't happen to VR or even mixed reality or XR down the road? Because like the toolkit that I mentioned, like VRTK, even the Oculus VR, I think they're coming up with a XRT the one that hello.
So
Okay,
Faisal,
am
are
I
you
still
there?
here? Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry,
all
I
right.
think.
You cut off for a little second there.
Yeah, sorry, my internet is not as it used to. So yeah, basically it's, to answer your question, yes, it is something possible in the future. It's looking forward to it and hype it.
All right, then. About this question, well, this question is technically already answered. So moving on to the designing stage. Someone asks, like, do you really have to draw the concept art in all the perspectives, or can you just develop the art straight away on the software?
It works both ways. If you can, if it's for marketing purposes, you can have to just draw the concept art from the single perspective. But to create the concept, to sketch it out from all possible perspective is something crucial if your application is required to do so. Like for instance, if you are creating like an escape room VR experience where you can explore every nook and cranny, every inch of your environment, then you would need to kind of like lay out everything from the sketch phase as well, because you want to design that. How would you want to design the puzzles, especially in the puzzle making? Take for instance, there is this one game called Belko Experiment, if I'm not mistaken. So it's an escape room kind of VR game, which requires you to kind of like crawl down under a table to find a key that's stuck below the table, basically. So there's a lot of things basically, because you have to go down there physically. So how would you design that? You need to design that from the design space, because you are intending your user to do so. as well as the within those kind of games, if you have require some UI, if you can trigger something on your hand or whatnot, those things you have to consider. How would you see it if the hand is like this? What do you see if it's like this? What do you see? So there's a lot actually you want to try to design, but there is a way you can design it from the software itself, or even like using VR experiences to design, like Google Tilt Brush, or even Medium, or what was it, the Paint Brush, if I'm not mistaken, on the Oculus Quest or on the VR. So those kind of experiences allows you to draw in VR. Okay, like Tilt Brush, I really love Tilt Brush as an experience, because you can actually draw in 3D. So I used to use Tilt Brush to actually conceptualize the experience, because I want to understand the placement, the sizing, and then the flow. If I were to have the chair over here, and then I would see the people over here, so I'm going to see the wall over there, so then I can gauge, okay, does this look good, does this feel correct? Like if I'm doing like we did with the 66.6, I have to really sketch out like the steering wheel is where, the phone is where, the interactable items is where. If I do this, what do I see? If I do this, what do I see? What can I interact with? So there's a lot of things you can really think of while you're in VR. So it's one thing to draw everything within all perspective, but it's another thing to actually test out those concepts within VR. So that's why work with placeholders, just sketch out a rough idea of the menu or the item or the interactable item, and then get them into VR as quickly as you can, and then just test it out. You don't really have to worry about the mechanics, the game mechanics on the speed of the bullet or whatnot. All those things can be worked out in the late during development. But in the design stage, the designers themselves needs to bring their design into VR. Like when we work with the VR showroom for Subaru, for the Autoplex, I have to constantly get my designers in VR, because like they would design the buttons and whatnot, and then I would tell them this, they would be placed here, such and such. But when I put it inside and I try it out, I might feel okay, but I need to get the designer's opinion, because they look good, because I see it from my monitor, and then I see in VR, oh, it might looks different. It might placement might not be so well. I thought it was gonna be this size, but then it was this size, and then, oh, okay, I need to press like this. So there's a lot of factors that would be more prevalent the more testing that you did. So like I said, you can draw a lot of things on the as much as you can, but get those design into the VR as quickly as possible. You cannot expect them, even from the developer side, they can play around with white boxing. Just place everything as a prefab, just to see how does it go. Does it make sense in navigation aspects? If you want to shoot, you want to slash or whatnot, is the placement is correct or whatnot. So then a lot of communications within our interdepartments. So that's basically it. So yeah, we can try to design it and get it into VR just to test it, and then you reiterate, and then you just repeat the process until you get the feeling right.
Right, I see. That's really insightful. Thank you. I think we have time for maybe about one more. And I believe this is actually a question or suggestion related to when you were talking about the reading the menu in VR. So this person asked if you could add a voice command for games such as Skyrim and the Fallout series. So instead of like using a menu that you would actually like physically hold and scrolling, maybe you could use a mic and then use voice commands instead, like open menu, quick save, equip a sword, equip a book, that kind of thing.
Yes, actually, I agree. It's moving forward. I think like if like the game actually allows voice commands, then you can really have the device or the application to detect, can recognize your speech. Then that is a very interesting idea in itself, because it gets the flow a lot more naturally, that you just have to say it out loud. Um, Not all VR headsets has that. I mean, it has a mic to communicate, but the programmers need to embed the speech recognition into it. For instance, like even like the HoloLens has that. The HoloLens has the built-in voice recognition where you can just interact using your voice. You can just like say open. You see a settings button there. Is just settings. It would open the settings, and then I can just say whatever on the screen. It would detect that, and then you would directly interact with it. So if you can apply that into VR, yes, that will basically help, especially when you're designing in the UI. So you minimize your design on the UI, but you are implementing the user interface using your voice. One thing though, when you're implementing voice, you need to make sure, apart from the speech recognition, you need to make sure the things that you say is unique to that particular game. And then because of speech recognition's limitations, there are levels of an identification of that particular voice or that particular speech. Like for instance, like the Android phone has the Google Assistant, right? If I were to say okay Google, it would open like now. Okay, now, no, not now. So it detects my voice. Sometimes it doesn't though. Sometimes it doesn't, because maybe I'm speaking too fast or too slow in a different tone. So you have to consider those things. So and then it needs to be the things that they have to say has to be in tune. It has to be in context with the application itself. If not, then it would be, how should I say, it won't be in context with the content itself. So it should be as natural as possible, but it cannot be too casual that randomly you say something that you did not intend, then it triggers the interactions. That's not something that users want as well. So it has to be something unique, something contextual, but something that's natural for the user to say. Like set open settings, open menu, fire, I don't know, call for backup. It like that. It doesn't matter what kind of game you're doing, like a war game or whatnot. Fire on 90 degrees. The more complex you get, then the more programming to get to train the speech recognition model. So this ventures into speech recognition, where I think APU has the face recognition recognition course, if I'm not mistaken. One of your students, I think something like that. So it might can venture with that. So this is where I feel like when you incorporate all of these things from other fields, collaboration is key. Like when we talk about audio, you would better to collaborate with somebody who's good at audio. We're talking about storytelling. You collaborate with somebody who's good at storytelling. When you collaborate with voice recognition, speak recognition, server based or whatnot, then you collaborate with that. You cannot expect your sole game developer to figure out everything by themselves because it's a huge scale to consider. So collaboration is key depending on what the targeted intention is to be. But to consider the question, yes, it is something doable. Yes, you can use voice to scroll up, scroll down. It's something doable if you can just program it. The HoloLens does it, has already done it, so why not VR? It's just a matter of just programming that into the application.
All right, then. I see. All right. I believe that is definitely all the time we have for you. Thank you, Mr. Faisal, for joining us and providing us with such useful insight. I definitely found it
Thank
really
you.
inspiring, and I also hope that many of you also learned something from this. And do remember to fill out this form for future feedback as well as getting your e-certificate. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for joining us on this session. And if you are joining for in 30 minutes time at 4:30 p.m., we will have another session with Mr. Ali Khalif from Unity Copenhagen. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, guys.